Let's talk now about steps for conducting successful HVAs. So this is a systematic approach, as we've described. And as a systematic approach, it requires a systematic implementation to assemble. So assembling a multidisciplinary and often multi-institutional team for HVA development is a vital starting point for developing a successful HVA. And participants in this effort can include emergency preparedness or disaster committees at the organizational and or jurisdictional level, subject matter expertise, so from academia or other areas of subject matter experts, and outside consultants who can come from the private and or public sectors. So again, a planning effort is only as successful as the assembled team that develops the plan. So that's why having a multidisciplinary and multi-institutional team that can provide different perspectives regarding this process is so critical. Here is a step-by-step depiction of the process for conducting a successful HVA. So from left to right, the first step is to identify potential hazards that pertain to one's jurisdiction or region. The second is to estimate the likelihood of occurrence of each of those respective hazards. The third step is to identify what the impact of each of those respective hazards would be on the community, the amount of physical or psychosocial or both in terms of impact on the community that's affected. The fourth step comprises evaluating the ability to mitigate the impact of each hazard. And last but not least, calculating the risk accordingly based on the preceding steps, documenting that, and prioritizing accordingly. Let's go into a little more nuance now, using the same diagrammatic representation regarding the steps for conducting a successful HVA. So when we look at this process, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, there's essentially an algebraic equation, which says that the probability times the impact of the event minus preparedness that exists prior to the event is equivalent to the risk. So we need to use those terms, if you will, in this algebraic equation to help us calculate the risk in step 5 of this diagram. And in identifying potential hazards in connection with step 1 of HVA development, we need to think about what we're concerned about. So step 1, as illustrated here, entails identifying potential hazards. These can include natural hazards, human-caused hazards, or technological hazards. We need to be mindful of all the various likely hazards that could impact a given community. And importantly, the nature of the hazards that could impact a given community differ from one community to another. For example, in South Florida, a snowstorm is not a likely hazard, obviously. In northern Minnesota, absolutely. So again, to this point, HVA development entails identifying potential hazards that are germane to the community that's conducting the respective hazard vulnerability assessment. Let's now talk about step 2 of hazard vulnerability assessment, which is estimating the likelihood of occurrence for each hazard. How do we do that? Well, we look at the known or identified risk based on the best available data, including historical data and predictive data. We may look at manufacturer or vendor statistics if there are particular hazards that are attached to materials that are used in industry that have gotten into the wrong hands, could represent a threat. So we need to use the best available and most current data at our disposal to estimate the likelihood of the occurrence of each respective hazard. Now let's discuss the third step of hazard vulnerability assessment, which is identifying the impact of each hazard. And to unpack this step, we need to think about 3 different categories of impacts. Generally speaking, at the top of this slide, you'll see impact on human lives, so threat to lives, illness, exposure, and injury, including mental health impacts. We cannot forget or ignore the psychosocial impacts of hazards. It's not just the physical impacts, it's also the psychosocial impacts that we must address. Next, we have to think about the impact on property, physical damage and losses. This can include critical infrastructure, physical plants, and supplies and equipment. And last but not least, at the bottom of this slide, we need to consider the impacts of a given hazard on businesses. Continuity of operations is a common term. So would the hazard, if it played out, in the form of a disaster, would it interrupt services of a business or a governmental agency? Could information be lost as a result of it? What kind of economic loss might occur? Are there staffing challenges or shortages that could arise as a result of this impact? And very importantly, last but not least, what is the public perception of this impact? Because risk communication is critical once we've developed a hazard vulnerability assessment, to leverage the hazard vulnerability assessment to craft risk communication messages should any of those events materialize. The fourth step of HVA development is to evaluate the ability to mitigate the impact of each hazard. Ideally, we want to keep the impact of the event as small, if not minimal, to non-existent, if at all possible, as we can. So that incorporates elements of planning, knowledge through training, exercises, and drills, developing, maintaining, and expanding partnerships between various stakeholders in public health and healthcare, and marshaling resources, which include facility resources and human resources, and identifying community resources as well. The last and very important step of HVA development is to calculate the risk, document it, and prioritize it. As alluded to earlier in this presentation, risk can be defined through this algebraic equation as the product of the probability multiplied by, in parentheses, the impact minus preparedness, and close parentheses. So all of these things can be calculated, and accordingly, the risk can and should be calculated and documented.